So Kevin, Richard Dawkins is probably one of the most prominent promoters of evolution that I'm aware of, and he was a big promoter of junk DNA. Now since the ENCODE project, there was a whole slew of articles that were published last year from the ENCODE scientists. Can you explain to us what is ENCODE and some of the background to ENCODE before we get into junk DNA?
Well, ENCODE is a consortium group of, I don't even know how many, I mean several dozen different scientists working to take a very, very small portion of the human chromosomes, the human genome, and analyze it in great detail to see exactly what it's doing, what's being made from it, what it looks like, what genetic content it contains. And they have, over the last several years, including, as you mentioned, a series of articles just last fall in 2012 that have been talking about this small segment of DNA in the human chromosomes and just how much it's doing. Instead of it being not much activity, it's a lot of activities, a lot of function, a lot of genetic events going on. And so, to their surprise even, they've had to conclude that it's not that most of the genome is not doing something, it's most of the genome is doing something.
And it's probably, you're probably even understating it, I would almost imagine. It sounds like there's these switching mechanisms going on, and as they continue to learn more, that there's just probably far more complexity happening than what they can just even imagine. And so previously they thought, oh, well, that just must be junk DNA left over from evolution.
There was one other thing I wanted to say about junk DNA, if we have a
Sure,
moment.
go ahead.
I want to say that, junk DNA was also proposed as a very powerful argument against creation, because the creator wouldn't put just all this useless garbage DNA in there. You know, so yeah, it was supposed to be, it was your vestigial organ version of DNA. You got little bits of pieces of what used to be our genes for gills or for fins when we were fish, and what used to be our genes for, scales when we were lizards and such, and of course we don't use those anymore, so they're undergoing degradation, and so they're just residual junk sitting in there. And that was the assumption, that was the argument. And now that we're seeing that in fact they do have function, they do have value, what we have is a prediction made based upon evolution is wrong. And the creations have been saying all along, I'll bet they will have function after all, and we're right. Now you're going to hear evolutionists admit, score 1-0 for creationists? No, but that's exactly the case. The evolutionists were predicting based upon evolution, they were wrong. Creation predicting based on creation, we were right.
And also important along those same lines is this, because of this prediction that this mysterious material in the DNA they suspected was junk, therefore they didn't really research it all that clearly.
That's an excellent point.
And so all of a sudden now they're really researching it, and they're finding all these medical possibilities.
So it really held back not only genomics and genetics, but as you say, medical breakthroughs for probably at least a decade or two. Absolutely, because what's the reason of studying the junk? Who cares?
Who needs to study junk DNA?
So there's one of many examples where evolution really was a hindrance to the development of science. Had they followed the creationist, prediction that it's going to have function, we should have been in there studying it as fast as we could, because we recognize this could be very vital too. Features of disease causing events and such, and absolutely that's what they're finding.
I want us to talk about the concept of the mitochondrial Eve. I think that there's some misinformation out there, as I've learned again from you and your presentation, and so I want us to talk about that. My own personal experience is I have a friend who was an old Earth creationist, and he wanted me to read this particular article on mitochondria and the mitochondria Eve and how it favors an old Earth and old time scale, this sort of thing. So I would like you to explain what mitochondrial Eve is. Of course, it has to do with DNA in the mitochondria and so on. So there it is. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, the mitochondria is an organelle. It's a little structure inside of our cells, but it actually contains a little bit of DNA. Like any DNA molecule, it's subject to mutations. It's subject to having its DNA sequence altered. Like any event in DNA where you have mutations occur, we can follow those mutations, at least in a limited manner, as far as what was the original sequence versus the sequence now. With mitochondrial Eve, this arose from some work done in the late 1980s where they began to recognize that we can take the sequences of the DNA in mitochondria of people living today, and we can start comparing them. Someone living here, someone living in Europe, someone living in Africa, someone living in Asia, and we can begin to compare them. And in that comparison, we can begin to see, well, what exactly are the differences in all of these family groups, people that are living apart from each other that presumably haven't interbred for a while. Mm-hmm. And they came to the conclusion that, in fact, they could track back and determine that there probably was one woman whose mitochondria is what we all now have. Okay. And she became known as mitochondrial Eve. Mm-hmm. Not out of respect of Eve of the Bible, it was a tongue-in-cheek joke. But the truth of the matter is, of course, now we can talk about Eve, because it's in the scientific literature. Okay. So the idea was, we're all descended from one woman, as the Bible says. So, yeah, very interesting. Now, what they did, though, was they said, yeah, but this woman lived, some 150,000 years ago. So obviously,
not
those
your
of
biblical
us, right? Those
here.
of us that would be young Earth creationists, biblical creationists, will say, well, that doesn't fit our time frame, right. Which is probably why your friend then would say, well, see, this disproves your position.
That's right.
And that was touted for a while, that the genetics, which is considered to be a very, solid science, if you will. You can't argue with genetics type thing. The genetics proves that Eve lived a long time ago, therefore, obviously, things aren't recent and young and such.
Right, so there's certain parts of science that is strictly historical and obviously very interpretive then.
Correct.
You make interpretations based upon historical issues like fossils and that sort of thing. But now you're talking about genetics, and there you have mathematics and calculations and things. And so, well, there should be some objective data here.
Yes, and as a geneticist, I would tend to agree. I think we can be a little more objective than maybe geologists and paleontologists can be sometimes, and because I think the data that we're able to work with is actually data from design. Even though that may not be the popular word that the evolutionists like to use, but because it's data from design, because DNA is designed, it's much more easy to interpret.
Okay.
Now, as far as the age of this mitochondrial Eve, we have to recognize that they put a fudge factor in, or shall I say an evolution factor.
They're fudging again? Okay.
Yes, here we go again, exactly. Same song, third verse. What they did to determine the time frame between us of today and this Eve of the past was not, okay, what's the rate of DNA mutation of the mitochondria? Because if you simply just did that, which would obviously make the most sense of how to do it, but the problem is if you just did that, they come up with an age of 6,000 years. And that's published in a 1998 article in Science, where they admit it would only be 6,000 years. So obviously that can't be right. That just can't be right. So what they did in this publication, this initial publication back in the late 80s, was they assumed evolution. They assumed that we and chimpanzees had evolved from a common ancestor. And so instead of using the human mutation sequence of our mitochondria, which would only give the 6,000 years, they looked at the difference between human mitochondrial DNA and chimpanzee mitochondrial DNA. See, so they imposed an evolutionary interpretation into the data to give that time frame. So here we are again imposing evolution into the interpretation, giving you an interpretation then that fits evolution.
You know, we're seeing this pattern over and over and over again. So as long as the evolutionists continue to assume that evolution is a fact, they can continue to provide evidence that supports their view.
Which makes total sense for them. And I'm not necessarily accusing them of an intentional falsehood. For them, it makes total sense because they are so convinced evolution is true that it makes sense to apply evolution to your interpretation.
But when I talk to people about this topic of creation evolution, it's one of the things that I like to try to point out to them is that so much of this data that seems to favor evolution is based upon this assumption that evolution is true.
Especially in paleontology and geology and genetics, especially. And here's another example in genetics of where we impose an evolutionary interpretation, and that's how we draw our conclusion. But when it's being told to the public, that's not being explained that, well, this is based upon we assumed evolution in our interpretation. See, and so then when they're presenting like mitochondrial Eve, they're presenting it as evidence for evolution, even though evolution was an integral component of the interpretation. When you pull the evolution interpretation, the evolutionary component out of the interpretation, what do you get? 6,000 years. What's that sound like? Sounds very biblical, sounds very young Earth. That's the real data. My friend Ron Carter did some subsequent work where he has actually got where he feels he's within about 6 bases of knowing Eve's original mitochondrial sequence. So he thinks he's that close. So using his sequence data, it's even tighter that Eve was only about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. That's why you don't hear evolutionists talk much about mitochondrial Eve anymore, because it's excellent proof for, or excellent illustration of, a recent creation.
So again, they're backtracking.
To the point of even abandoning it.
So then likewise, mitochondria DNA, which was thought to be a huge, huge friend to the evolutionists, proving, I mean, just slam dunk. Just mathematically, like my friend. This is it. This is evidence for at least old Earth.
Yes.
And now we're seeing that really, if you look at the data, it's like, no, this is clear evidence for a young Earth.
Very clear. To the point, so clear, in fact, that to say you won't see evolutionists, knowledgeable evolutionists anyway, very much talk about mitochondrial Eve.
Now, you were also saying that some of these published articles are clearly stating this, that that it points to like 6,000 years, and then there's this extrapolation under the assumption of evolution. That's kind of what you were saying?
Yes, the 1998 Science paper, in fact, says specifically, if we don't put an evolutionary interpretation into the data, we come up 6,000 years. Now, this paper was not arguing for the need of a evolutionary extrapolation. It was arguing for, obviously, mitochondrial DNA can't be used as a molecular clock. That's what it was arguing. Why? Because it's 6,000 years. That can't be right because we know evolution is true, and therefore you see the paradigm of evolution drives the interpretation of the data. And if the data doesn't fit evolution, then it must be wrong. There must be an error in it. And that's what that paper was about.